I'm Limo Milan, and in this video we're going to look at Ableton Live's compression devices. So first let's describe what compression is. It's literally the automated change of volume of a sound signal. Originally designed to replace the need for an engineer to ride the signal of a signal to try and get it to be a bit more consistent in volume. Compression allows us to do much more than that these days, and it can be either a practical process or a creative process as well. So let's look at Ableton Live's devices. We have compressor, glue compressor, multiband dynamics. To some degree we have drum bus because this has a built-in compression function, and then we also have limiter, which is a very specific type of compression with specific settings. So we're going to focus on the first two out of the lot here, which is compressor and glue compressor. Glue compressor is modelled on a classic British mixing console, so it has a certain flavour of sound to it and behaviour to the way it changes your volume. And Ableton Live's kind of compressor device is a much more standardised, transparent type of compressor, which is good for controlling signals and generally doing stuff without adding too much colour to the sound. So if I just get rid of glue compressor there, I'm going to just drag this over to my kick drum track here. And we're going to just do some compression and get used to the controls while we can visualize this too. So there's a couple of things I'm going to do. I'm going to just loop around a bar. So I'm going to do Command and L once I've highlighted that section. And I'm going to highlight the track above and the kick and hit Z just to zoom into those true tracks as much as possible. And I've set up this track above the kick drum to basically be a capped track. So we'll visualize what the compressor is doing to the signal as we modify its parameters. So the compressor itself, the key things to get used to is it has a threshold control. And that basically means is where in the range between the lowest signal possible in volume and the highest signal possible in volume of your sound source, where at what point does the compressor react? So if the threshold is all the way down, the compressor reacts to any changes in volume. So it's immediate, no matter how quiet the sound signal is. If we set it to just be slightly down from the highest possible peak, it's just reacting to the highest peaks of the sound signal. So you can choose based on what you're trying to do with the sound. You can choose anywhere within the lowest to the highest part of the sound signal where the compressor will actually start reacting. Now, how it reacts is the next few controls we've got to look at. We have a ratio control. So if we have our threshold, let's say at a decibel level of -30, and it has a ratio of 2:1, it means that any sound signal above that -30 decibels part will be compressed at a 2:1 ratio. So if it's 2:1, if 2 decibels go above the threshold, 1 decibel comes out. If 4 decibels go in, 2 decibels go out because it's doing a 2:1 ratio. And we have 4:1 ratios. The simplest way to explain it, if 4 decibels are going above the threshold, 1 decibel comes out. If 8 go above the threshold, 2 decibels come out because it's a 4:1 ratio. Now, how fast this is applied is where the attack and the release stage come into play. So the attack at the moment is 2 milliseconds. Now, if we set this recording track to go so we can see what the kick drum's doing, and I start reducing the threshold and maybe the ratio too, you'll start seeing that compression is being applied to the signal, but it's not happening straight away because that attack time is not set to its fastest value. So as you see, as I modify the attack stage, a tiny bit of the kick can either slip through with fast attack times, or a lot of the kick drum in its original volume can poke through before the compression is applied afterwards. Now, one dial that's making it seem very loud at the moment, or one parameter, sorry, is this makeup gain control. So the makeup is basically automatically adjusting for the reduction in volume, or what we call the gain reduction of volume, how much it needs to turn the signal up to maintain the same kind of volume level. And it's a little bit of a cheat to our ears because it sounds potentially better because we've just made the sound louder. We've modified the volume of the signal, and then the makeup gains just ramp the signal back up to make up for that gap that's been made between what can be the loudest and what is the loudest signal possible. So as a good practice, especially when starting out, if you turn off the makeup gain, you can manually change the output level once you start sound shaping, and then turn the device on and off against the original and your new version to make sure that the shape of the sound is better, not just that it's gotten louder. So attack time, release time on a short sound like this won't necessarily be that kind of much of a broad changing aspect of how we process the sound, but it does still have a little bit of an effect. So let's have a look at that. I'll just change that output level now that I turned the makeup gain off first. So I'll have this turned off. Okay, now let's do that with the actual recording going so we can see it. Okay, so we've got a slight change to the shape going on now. What I've done is I've allowed that attack stage to come through. I eased off on the ratio so it wasn't quite squeezing everything above the threshold so much. It was more of a milder change in volume over the threshold setting. And then I've modified the attack and release stage just to make sure that the time it takes for the compression to time out and listen again, waiting for the next signal to make it compress, it isn't too fast or too slow. So another aspect we have here is the auto stage for the release. You can get the compressors to kind of listen to the signal as it moves and kind of dictate where it thinks the release stage is. The key thing with the release stage is, especially with sounds that maybe have louder peaks than and some quieter peaks, and the threshold set to only listen to some of the louder peaks, is the release stage is basically the kind of the breathe time it has to then go back to listening to apply compression again. So if we set the release to be too long, it doesn't get a chance to ever get back to the gain reduction, returning to nothing and then kicking in again. I'll show you that now. This is our gain reduction meter here. And you notice that the setting right now, in between each kick, it has a chance for the gain reduction to stop being applied. And it should do, because we have no audio between these kicks. There is a point where no compression should be happening. So as long as the release stage is snappy or fast enough that it allows the compressor to return back to its listening state, getting ready to compress again, we won't have a problem where the first kick might be loud, but then because the release stage just overlaps the next one, the next one, the next one, it won't get that suffocating feeling that it's just keeping the volume too low, regardless of whether the actual motion of the sound or the peaks in the sound are making it start and stop at the right points. Okay, so that's the main kind of parts of compressor now. So we're going to move over to another sound. So I'll just press X to zoom out. Let's move over to this ARP wet. So Command and L just to loop around that. And let's just solo this. We might have to turn it up a little bit just so we get a good listening volume. We're going to get another compressor device just so we can actually have a look at some other settings here. So we've done ratio, attack, release, looked at the auto function, but we have threshold and we have these peak and RMS behaviors. We're talking about compression today, so we're not necessarily going to talk about expansion, which is the opposite of making things jump out of the sound in terms of its volume, but we have peak and RMS. So peak basically is what we've already been using. It is quick enough to follow the peaks. That's the main thing. So RMS is different. It's an averaging volume change. So it won't be so quick to respond to the very momentary spikes are transient in the signal. It'll be a bit more relaxed about when it applies gain reduction or how fast it applies gain reduction. And it can be quite musical and very useful on things that don't have so much rhythmic information to them. So if I set it to RMS, take off makeup, and you see the difference in the way the gain reduction moves. If I put it on peak, it's a bit more rhythmic. It's trying to respond to the small transient that changes in volume, the rhythmic stuff in there. If we set it to RMS, it's a bit more lazy, should we say. And that can be quite useful because it doesn't necessarily mean that it's jumping up and down with the rhythm of a sound. So it gives it a bit more of a smooth, plain kind of presence within your mix. And that's a good reason to be using compression, to try and make something to seem a bit more better set within a mix, not so dynamic in its volume changes. Okay, so the other things to cover with compressor in terms of the features we have here is we have a few different views. So we have this main kind of view where everything's like minimal. It's called collapse view. Then we have our transfer curve view, which if we look at it now, that's our threshold. And then this is the gain reduction happening. So this is how it's changing the volume in response to the signal exceeding that threshold. And then we have our activity view, which basically shows the compression happening in a very visual way, a little bit like how I was recording the audio to show you in the first instance. So this line is our gain reduction, or it can be the output. That's our signal in the grey there in the backdrop, and our threshold is that line. So for instance, if I put it back on peak, and I set the threshold to be just within the bouncy peaks of the sound, not within the body of the volume. You can see that the gain reduction is following those peaks very accurately because the threshold is just where the activity of the sort of minor little flourishes of volume are happening as well. So the view there is very useful to be able to see what's going on with compression if you want to visualize it as you go as well. The other aspect of this is the logarithmic and linear modes of the compressor. And basically that just means how it responds to applying those volume changes. So logarithmic is more of a curve, whereas linear is like a straight line. So linear can work in certain respects, but logarithmic is generally a little bit more musical in its way that it approaches things. It approaches things more in a kind of a real world behavior of sounds rather than mathematically perfect way of changing the volume. So let's have a look at glue compressor next. So I'm going to load up the other drums section here and go for glue compressor. And let's have a look at these controls. So we have a threshold control, a makeup which is manual only, a soft clipping section, which is very useful in terms of being able to change, push the signal into a clipping section, which basically is a saturation that rounds the signal off and adds some harmonics. So it could be quite nice to thicken a sound. And then we have attack, release, and ratio. And much like in compressor where we have those linear logarithmic curves in terms of how it changes the volume and the kind of curve that it does it at, how immediate it is. The glue compressor has its own kind of behavior. Again, it's based on that classic British mixing console, which it has a very iconic sound that's been used on countless records over the decades. So let's have a look at this on the drums. So the attack, again, we can let a little bit of the sound slip through before it gets compressed. And the release, we can set it to an automatic, so the A setting, or we can set it to certain fixed release times as well. So it has a different sound to it, partially because of the soft clipping, but also because of those differences in how it treats the gain reduction process and how quick it does it, and the shaping of it too. Now what you can do with Glue Compressor 2, or you can also do it with a normal compressor, is try and work in parallel. So a good technique for this, or the sort of the classic way of doing this, would be to go a bit over the top with your compression, so it creates more of a bed of the sound. So it's very gain reduced, it's had a lot of its dynamics reduced, and it might be too much to play just on its own, but you can use the dry wet control to get a sense of the original's kind of character, its punch, and then this bed version of the sound, which is a heavily compressed one, and find the good balance between the two. So I'm going to overdo the compression now. Let's go to the dry signal. So we can get a balance between those two versions of the signal, the dry and that extreme version of compression too. So the other types of compressor is the limiter, which is literally an infinite ratio. So we talked about 2 to 1. So 2 decibels go in, 1 comes out. An infinite ratio means that basically nothing's getting through it when it exceeds the threshold. And we can do the sort of the equivalent of this by increasing the gain of the limiter. We've got a gain reduction here. Now, because a limiter is designed to catch very, very fast peaks to try and make sure we can get a little bit more volume out of our signal, we can also set it to look ahead here and basically pre-read the signal that's coming to it, and therefore be ready for those really fast peaks a little bit ahead of time and have a better chance of catching them as well. We also have an release stage, which is automatic by default, but we can dial that in manually if we find we want to. And yeah, the limiter is quite good for limiting, so trying to just control the main peaks of the sound and get an ability to create a bit of space at the top in terms of the volume being pulled down with the limiting, and then get a chance to pull the whole thing up in volume. But it's also quite good as an extreme control and just really smashing something into the limiters to give it a bit of aggression. So finally we have multiband. So multiband is this device here, and let's put this somewhere different. Let's put this on our other backing sounds, this track here. Listen to this one. So again, I'm just going to turn up the volume of this so we have something a bit louder to listen to. Okay, so multiband dynamics is basically the equivalent of taking a filter, so something that splits up the frequencies of a sound, so lows, mids and highs, and sending them to their own compressor, so they're independent. Now you might choose to send just one of the bands to compression and choose to compress that particular band, leaving the other ones intact in their original state, or you might decide to massively modify the signal to get a different kind of sound out of it, or again, more volume out of it too. Very good for increasing your loudness. On that note, all of these devices do have presets, and there's one preset for the multiband dynamic which has become famous and actually released separately by other people imitating the sound of this as VST, so you can load them into other DAW or digital audio workstations. So if I go to the Q key and I go down, this is the preset here, it's called OTT, and it's basically a very maximized, squashed version of all the bands of your signal being squeezed to get a lot of aggression and volume out of it. So let's load that one in for a second. I'm just going to go to the off button. So we'll listen to this without and then listen to it with. So this isn't a dry wet control here I'm using this time, it's more of a how strong the compression happening within the multiband processor is being applied at. There's more than just normal downwards compression going on here, which is what we're used to with the other two devices. But as I said, it's a bit beyond the scope to go too much into depth on the multiband compressor. So if we would start this off with a new preset though, we can go through a very basic kind of approach with it. So the main thing we're looking at here is our above compression, which is this section here, which has the same thing. It has a threshold, how deep down into the signal it will go, and then it has a ratio control. Then we have a time-based section, which is our attack and our release stage. And then we have the individual bands themselves, so high, mid, and lows. So if I press solo and we listen to this drum beat, so let's treat this mid-band. Let's say we want to get some more presence out of the mid-band. It wants to be more forwards in the mix. So we want to squeeze it so it can be pulled up in volume and bring it further forward in the mix. What we need to do is pull down the threshold, which we can do from here. Let's see if we can single out what the mid-band is a little bit more by using these crossover points. Making sure it didn't have too much of the low end rumble that's going on in the sound, not too much of the hi-hat sounds, the percussive stuff going on there. I just want it to be that kind of presence of mid-range. Okay, so that's my signal happening here. Let's pull down the threshold. And then let's pull the ratio down. What we see here is the amount of gain reduction happening, which is around about -10. So we can make up for that by adding 10 decibels here. So I can go to time and make it so it's super fast, it doesn't let any transients through, and I'll set the release stage based on how it sounds rhythmically. Okay, so take the solo off, let's listen to it without. And you can hear there that the mid-band is brought a lot more forward because we did the same with the other compressors. We reduced its dynamic range, and then the gap that was left at the top of the volume was then brought back up to make up for the actual reduction in volume that's happening. Okay, so we've looked at Ableton Live's compressor, glue compressor, limiter, and multiband dynamics processor. These are all useful to either reshape a sound or get a general sense of change in volume and perception of these sounds too. And it's always worth trying a few of them out for each sound that you process to see which suits best in the context of your own music.